HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920, by Manisha Sinha, read by Deepa Samuel. According to the best testimony now, the population of the earth, embracing Caucasians, Mongolians, Malays, Africans, and Americans, is about 1,300 millions, of whom only 375 millions are white men, or less than one-fourth, so that in claiming exclusive rights for white men, you degrade nearly three-quarters of the human family, made in the image of God and declared to be one blood, while you sanction a caste offensive to religion, an oligarchy inconsistent with republican government, and a monopoly which has the whole world as its footstool. Charles Sumner, 1866. Introduction. The Great Contest. Our republic is itself a strong argument in favor of composite nationality. Frederick Douglass, 1869. On February 20th, 1868, Amy Circuit, a freedwoman in Newberry, South Carolina, was murdered in cold blood by two white men. Her case was duly recorded in the field office records of the South Carolina Freedmen's Bureau by a federal agent. The killers were Samuel Rudd, who worked on the premises of John G. Lifford, and Lifford himself. They invaded the Circuit home in search of Amy's husband, referred to in the records variously as Charles or Coleman. Coleman testified that he had earlier confronted Rudd for whipping his son for being sassy to him. When the two white men later entered his home, Rudd shot Amy. For their attempts to protect their son from being treated like a slave, Amy lost her life and Coleman was arrested. The local magistrate, J.E. Peterson, known to the Bureau for his involvement in many outrages against freed people, detained Coleman for assault. But the Bureau agent intervened and arrested Rudd and Lifford for Amy's murder. After a few days, Coleman retracted his statement after being visited by the Rudd and Lifford families, who dropped charges of assault against him. Amy's death, Coleman now stated, could have been accidental. It is not clear what pressure was brought to bear on the new widower. What is clear is that Rudd and Lifford were released, and Amy's murder went unpunished. Like countless freed people, the Circuits paid dearly for their freedom. The story of Amy's death could be the history of Southern Reconstruction after the Civil War in microcosm. The attempt of freed people to breathe meaning into their freedom. The attempt of the Freedmen's Bureau, a stand-in for the government, to intervene in a miscarriage of justice, and the reassertion of the authority of local white elites to act with impunity and defy the rule of law. As the activist scholar W.E.B. Du Bois observed in 1935, the slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again toward slavery. Building on Du Bois, who wrote the first great history of Reconstruction, this book narrates the rise and fall of what I call the Second American Republic. Amy Circuit was murdered at the start of Reconstruction, when black men attained the right to vote and hold political office. In the following decades, when Southern states started systematically overthrowing Reconstruction governments, things got even worse in the region. Where I depart from most historians of Reconstruction is in my attempt to link such developments in the South with others across the nation. Daniel and Caroline Grant moved from Massachusetts to Wisconsin in the 1850s. Daniel was always coming up with get-rich-quick schemes, whining and begging his wife and her family for money and looking out for financial opportunities in the Southwest, especially after the Civil War, whether that meant taking advantage of poorly paid Southern black labor or setting himself up in Indian country. Nothing bothered him more than seeing dispossessed indigenous nations living on reservations and supported, however meagerly, by the federal government. He blamed them for his own failure to succeed. Daniel Grant and other settlers conveniently repurposed their criticism of freed people during Reconstruction as wards of the government to Indians, who were then blamed for their own poverty, viewed as lazy and dependent people who were not fit for self-government or equal citizenship. Daniel complained about the reservations. The Indian must have a large amount of land and then fed at government expense, and many whites forbidden at getting a living at their own expense. What folly, but so mote it be. His jaundiced view did not capture the full history of indigenous people, especially those who navigated settler society and politics to survive in its political economy of plunder. While benefiting from homestead legislation and the military campaigns against Western indigenous nations, settlers like Daniel Grant developed an anti-government politics that was also voiced by reactionary Southern elites during Reconstruction. Despite being the principal beneficiary of government handouts, men like him propagated the myth of individual success. The final conquest of the West and destruction of indigenous sovereignties paralleled the overthrow of Southern Reconstruction and pointed the way to the rise of an overseas American empire, as the U.S. government was fully diverted from emancipatory to imperial aims. During the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Working Men's Party organized mass rallies of the Grand Army of Starvation, an allusion to the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternal organization of Union Army veterans in Chicago. Conservatives, however, designated the party a communist organization and deemed the workers mere foreigners, German, Irish, and half-savage Bohemians. One of the speakers at such a gathering was Albert Parsons, a repentant one-time Confederate from Texas who had married a former slave, Lucy Parsons, a labor leader in her own right, and supported Reconstruction. Both had escaped racist terror in Texas and resettled in Chicago, their trajectory revealing the connections between the fight for democracy in the South and the North. As Parsons put it, my enemies in the Southern states consisted of those who oppressed the black slave. My enemies in the North are among those who would perpetuate the slavery of the wage workers. Women activists like Lucy Parsons are central to the history of the Second American Republic. Reconstruction not only inaugurated the women's suffrage movement in the United States, it also unleashed broad emancipatory goals for American women. While freed women like Amy Circuit sought to protect a homegrown citizenship against violent assaults in the post-war South, abolitionist feminists demanded the social and gendered reconstruction of American democracy. Histories of Reconstruction are riddled with simplistic racial dualisms of Northern white teachers and black freed people. But relatively forgotten Northern black abolitionist teachers like Ellen Garrison Jackson and Rebecca Primus left behind a record of their work with free people, the racist abuse they suffered, and their efforts to expand the boundaries of American democracy in fighting for black and women's rights simultaneously. In her letter to her parents in Hartford, Connecticut, Primus detailed the harassment she and other colored teachers suffered at the hands of Secession and Copperhead whites in Royal Oak, Maryland. She hailed, however, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first federal civil rights law in U.S. history, as promising impartial justice, so that rights which are so unjustly withheld from us now have been obtained. In a subsequent letter, Primus referred to Jackson's suit against the station master in Baltimore for throwing her and another black teacher, Mary Anderson, out of the ladies' room while they were waiting for their train under the new civil rights law. When the station master, Adam Smizer, tried to settle the case, Jackson wrote to the American Missionary Association's Reverend S. Hunt, "We could not agree to compromise just then, and no other time, unless we can have all our rights conceded to." She recalled the Southern white woman who had first insulted us, and how Smizer had grasped my arm so tightly that I felt compelled to cry out, "Let me alone! Take your hand off me!" Engaging in the suit, Jackson confessed, required a great degree of moral courage. To act in the matter, it is no trifling subject. She wrote how all the colored people in the area rallied around her and aided her in her lawsuit. Jackson viewed the struggle for equal rights during Reconstruction as a peculiarly women's fight. She noted, "Our soldiers went forth with sword and bayonet to contend for right and justice. We could not do that, but we contend against outrage and oppression wherever we find it, firmly standing and giving away for the rudest shocks." Black women like Primus and Jackson unveiled a new understanding of American democracy during Reconstruction, where black and women's rights were not competing but overlapping struggles. They refused to heed the siren call of some suffragists who would pit one against the other. Their Reconstruction vision encompassed women's suffrage as well as freed people's rights. In this book, I argue that the history of Reconstruction is also women's history. The rise and fall of the Second American Republic narrates the achievements and the violent overthrow of Reconstruction. Expanding the usual temporal bounds of Reconstruction, which is customarily understood to have begun in 1865 and to have ended in 1877, it moves from the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which, I argue, should be seen as the last Reconstruction Amendment. The book aims to depict a great contest for and against interracial democracy that played out not just in the South, but in the North and West, and even beyond American shores. The main concern of Reconstruction was the plight of the formerly enslaved, but its fall affected other groups as well, from women and workers to immigrants and Native Americans. The defeat of Black freedom was the defeat of American democracy. The crucial question of Reconstruction is this: how did interracial democracy progress under the revolutionary impetus of the war and emancipation? And why did that effort unravel by the end of the 19th century? Reconstruction birthed a national citizenship, expanding the boundaries of political belonging, rights, and claims on the nation-state. Building a composite nation, as the self-emancipated abolitionist Frederick Douglass argued, was the greatest challenge of the Second American Republic. It was a fraught and contested project. Nearly 750,000 Americans perished in the Civil War, and nearly 100,000 indigenous people were killed in wars, on reservations, and in assimilation campaigns during the second half of the 19th century. Around 4 million enslaved won their freedom and citizenship rights, only to be subject to a new regime of racist terror after the destruction of Reconstruction. Despite the emergence of the suffrage movement, women remained disenfranchised. Asian immigrants were systematically excluded, and strikes by workers of all ethnicities violently put down. Within this larger frame, the book focuses on the debate over who is a citizen and the role of the state in expanding or constricting rights and indigenous sovereignty. Its primary theme is the ongoing tension between democracy and capitalism, with the latter's historical entanglement in slavery and imperialism. After the industrial takeoff in the United States, The reconstruction of capitalism proved to be successful even as its reconstruction of democracy faltered. Democracy in the United States has always been rigorously challenged by forces of political and economic reaction. The rapid industrialization of the country and the dismal conditions of labor that followed Reconstruction made a mockery of the free labor ideology of the victorious North. New wars and imperial dreams of empire, inspired by the regime of racist apartheid in the post-war South and the conquest of Western Indian nations, further hobbled American democracy at home and abroad. By the end of the 19th century, a formal U.S. empire would subject people from the Caribbean to the Philippines to colonial rule. The demise of the Second American Republic inaugurated an era of hierarchy and inequality, racial, ethnic, gendered, and economic, rather than one of equal citizenship promised by the War for Emancipation and Reconstruction. Connecting the struggle for Black citizenship with debates over ethnicity, gender, economic autonomy, and sovereignty that raged at the same time, I aim to show that we have missed much by confining our vision of the end of Reconstruction to the South. It is not only the chronology and scope of this book, but its interpretation that is thus at odds with conventional narratives, which have emphasized how the United States was able to develop a unique and long-lasting experiment in Republican government by expanding democracy, incrementally but consistently, to groups previously denied inclusion. In the prevailing view, the Anglo-American tradition of liberal democracy is distinct from the more volatile histories of continental Europe, or so the story goes. From simplistic stories of American exceptionalism to more sophisticated analyses of democracy in the Western world, the old consensus cannot, in fact, explain the violent upheavals of the mid to late 19th century in the United States. As President Abraham Lincoln put it in December 1862, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history." The Civil War resulted in the destruction of the First American Republic and birthed the Second. My notion of a Second Republic comes from the history of French republicanism. In borrowing that terminology to describe events in the United States, I seek to highlight the growth of reactionary authoritarianism in the post-war South, a type of politics we often associate with Europe or the rest of the Americas. Put simply, the long afterlives of slavery and imperialism are as important to understanding U.S. history as are more familiar ameliorative tales about the abolition of slavery and the expansion of democracy and citizenship rights during Reconstruction. The story of the contest between the two is designed to capture an essential and ongoing theme in the United States, which was never all one or the other. Not only that, but the history of the unmaking of Reconstruction reveals the global significance of the first abortive experiment to transform the slaveholders' republic into an interracial democracy. My goal is to put Reconstruction in a broad transnational context and to thereby demonstrate that its long death has as much to tell us as its short-lived triumph. Other recent work has expanded Reconstruction's chronological and spatial boundaries, yet, unlike these histories, this book emphasizes disjuncture rather than continuity. The Reconstruction of the West was not a process parallel to Southern Reconstruction, but rather must be understood apiece with its downfall. To view the bold experiment in interracial democracy, recounted in Eric Foner's canonical Reconstruction, as the same political process that led to the subjugation of indigenous nations, nativism, and the triumph of industrial capitalism and imperialism, is to completely miss the contestation that shaped this era. I argue that these events must be viewed as part of the long overthrow of Reconstruction and of the abolitionist aims of the American Civil War, and not as their consequence. Where some see the seamless expansion of the American nation-state, I show change and open conflict over democracy, citizenship, sovereignty, and political economy. Central to this history is the truly emancipatory moment represented by the new civic democracy of Reconstruction and its significant legacy of progressive constitutionalism and democratic governance. The novel notion that the government is responsible for expanding rights and maintaining the welfare of all its citizens, regardless of race and previous condition of servitude. Debates on the nature of governance, whether all citizens and non-citizens are equally rights-bearing individuals and claimants before the state, defined the Second American Republic. Another interpretive thread concerns capitalism and democracy, which were not born as conjoined twins in the United States or the rest of the world. To see them as such is to root one's claims in ideology, not history. More often than not, the aims of one were antagonistic to the goals of the other. It would be the defeat of the interracial democracy and the anti-slavery state of Reconstruction that paved the way for the reign of capital and the narrowing of emancipation to contract freedom and the triumph of laissez-faire liberalism, what we call political conservatism today. In this historical process, government activism on behalf of its citizens, former slaves, farmers, women, immigrants, and labor came to be seen as misguided, if not horrifying. Instead, the full military and coercive powers of the government were deployed to repress indigenous nations, immigrants, and labor. A neo-Confederate political vision, a fundamentally anti-democratic, racist ideology, combined with anti-big government rhetoric, was reborn. It went not only national, but international. Dressed up in fundamentalist religious idiom, racism redeemed the South and the West and provided the rationale for American colonialism. The lost cause mythology of the South was not just nostalgic window dressing for sordid industrialization. It became its ideological handmaiden. There can be no doubt that the destruction of racial slavery and the reconstruction of the misbegotten Southern Confederacy fundamentally remade the entire republic. That revolution transformed the U.S. Constitution. Long before historians did so, the abolitionist William Goodell proclaimed in 1861 in his newspaper, The Principia, that the Civil War was the second American Revolution that portended the national abolition of all inequalities. The abolitionist feminist Angelina Grimke Weld, in her 1863 Address of the Women's National Loyal League to the Soldiers of Our Second American Revolution, argued that the Southern slavocracy threatened the freedom of all American citizens and sought to enslave working men of all colors. They were both right, in a way, though Goodell's prophecy has yet to come to pass. The massive economic and political dislocations of the Gilded Age that followed Reconstruction were not just the product of the changes wrought by the Civil War and Reconstruction. They were also a result of the defeat of the prior era's emancipatory legacy. They represented, to borrow the words of a historian of modern Europe, Arno J. Mayer, the persistence of the old regime, a virulently anti-democratic, hierarchical politics that justified the new global political economy of industrial capitalism and imperialism. As the previous quotation suggests, the international scene is important to this history, and its importance goes beyond terminology. It is often claimed that the American Republic was the only one to grant citizenship rights, including voting for adult men, to the formerly enslaved after the abolition of slavery. In fact, France, which has an equally long democratic republican tradition, preceded the United States in granting voting rights to black freedmen in the colonies when the Second French Republic abolished slavery in 1848. After the French Revolution, the First Republic had also briefly enfranchised free black male citizens, just as propertied black men in the United States enjoyed the right to vote after the American Revolution. Black American men retained the right to vote only in a handful of New England states before the Civil War. In both cases, political equality was imperfect, to say the least, and in the American South, black citizenship was undermined by racist terror and draconian legal mechanisms for another 100 years after the downfall of Reconstruction. In employing the Second American Republic framework, this book draws its inspiration not only from the history of French republicanism, but also from the rest of the Americas, where republics rose and then fell to the forces of reaction and authoritarianism. The American experiment in democratic republicanism, abolition, and black citizenship was not unique, but part of a broader global transition from slavery to freedom, from racial privilege to emancipation to a conservative backlash. In the Americas, one can discern a broader Atlantic Reconstruction that included Cuba and Brazil, two countries where the second slavery of the 19th century crumbled after slavery was destroyed in the U.S. South. Along similar lines, the emergence of a strong nation-state in the United States in the 1870s paralleled the national unification of Germany and Italy. Universalist Republican ideals that powered emancipation and democratic movements eventually came into conflict with authoritarian nationalisms that posited national homogeneity, one people, one language, one culture, one religion, and, most tragically, one race. It is no coincidence that the rise of formal American empire occurred simultaneously with the scramble for Africa among European powers and the heyday of imperialism at the turn of the century. Imperialist nationalisms, fueled further by the first military-industrial complex, led to the Great War of 1914 to 1918. The rise and fall of the Second American Republic, in fact, had global consequences. The defeat of the slave power in the Civil War inspired the enslaved and abolitionists in Spain, Cuba, and Brazil, but the demise of interracial democracy in the United States also contributed to the unchecked emergence of imperialism and, later, fascism. By the early 20th century, the United States was not just the city upon a hill, an unprecedented experiment in democratic republicanism, but it now could serve as a barbaric model of racist oppression. The Jim Crow South and genocidal warfare against Indians would inspire the Nazis in Germany as well as the apartheid state of South Africa. Another international comparison sheds light on the demise of Reconstruction. The more successful reconstructions undertaken by the United States and its allies of Germany and Japan after the Second World War reveal that the key ingredient for a long-lasting reconstruction is not indefinite military rule, but a genuine acceptance of defeat and moral culpability by the losers, or at least most of them. Much of the American South and its conservative political allies in the rest of the nation never came to terms with the destruction of slavery. They continued to resist black citizenship as well as Reconstruction laws and constitutional amendments. The Jim Crow South spun victory out of defeat with the enduring myth of the lost cause to justify the overthrow of Reconstruction. The actual history of the Confederacy as an anti-democratic, pro-slavery project in open rebellion against the American Republic and its founding ideals was buried under a comforting narrative of national reconciliation between the North and the South.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?